Thank you all for coming. This is a story that is close to me because I am ein Antonufken. My great-great-grandparents are part of this story, and because they came, I'm here. That's important. Many Mennonites stayed in Russia, and some of us know the horrors and the heartache and what happened to them.
Shawn,
And
there's
for some
somebody
reason,
wants to go by you.
we're here.
Hi. Okay, I found you. Thank you.
And just to be accurate, that is not the lone tree. But it is a lone tree. The lone tree story begins in Holland. The Anabaptists at the time of Menno Simons and shortly after faced, as we know, intense persecution for their faith. Many of them, millions of them, through the years died for their faith. And at some point, some records would say as early as 1540, there was an exodus from Holland into Royal Poland. So at some point that was under German rule, later Prussia. I think that's where they transitioned from the Dutch language to the German language. And after several centuries in that country, the government, which had been very friendly to them, became much more militaristic and restrictive. For example, the fee not to serve in the armed services was many, many, many times more than a man's annual income. They were restricted from purchasing land. I suspect that maybe after the Mennonites, in their ingenuity and ability, had drained the swamps, turned swampland into productive farmland, the local government said we would like that for our own people. I think that was perhaps part of the equation. But they made it extremely difficult for them to stay. And so at that same time, Catherine the Great, the Tsarina over there in Russia, had recently acquired more land in Russia, especially in the Ukraine, and was offering many people, not only Mennonites, but many people, to come and settle there and civilize and make productive those lands. And she made a special offer, and it was very attractive. Autonomy, which meant they could have their own villages, their own government, their own schools, their own churches, their own language, and also be exempted from military service, which was the paramount requirement that they were interested in, as well as just having freedom to worship God. The caveat was that they were not to proselytize. And how they managed the Great Commission with that, I'm not certain. But they went. And many of them located in the Moloshna in Ukraine and became very prosperous there. They took their experience, they took their abilities, they took their economy and their ingenuity and industry, and they became very productive in the Moloshna. This group, however, for some reason, some from Chechovka, which was the area in Royal Poland, Prussia, where they had lived, stopped midway between their old home and the Moloshna. From their old home in Chechovka to the Moloshna was about 1,000 miles. I don't know why they stopped. It may be that they lacked sufficient resources to travel further. It may be that the season was not favorable for travel. It may be that they just lost will and heart. But for some reason, they stopped in the Bohemian region of Polish Russia, near Gdansk and Warsaw and the city of Ostrog, and that's where they colonized. The conditions there were very less favorable for them than in the Moloshna. They were not privileged to own land, for example. They could rent land, crown land, but the rent was 50%. There was really no way for them to prosper and advance economically. Many of them worked as woodsmen, sawing lumber, Many of them grew and spun flax in their homes to sell in the markets, and they eked out their living there and were content to stay there. They formed the villages there, one of which was Antonovka, which is special to this story because that's where many of the Lone Tree people came from. That one formed in 1804, and they later became known as the Cantoners because they were over here by Canton, or the Lone Tree people. There is the trek. There's Chekhovka up there in the upper left, where they settled after leaving Holland, which was over here to the upper left. And then the pilgrimage down southeast, all the way there to Ortitsa, Molushna, and off the screen is Alexandrovol. For some reason, the Alexandrovol people went all the way and colonized there in the Molushna. But right in here is where the Lone Tree people stopped and where they lived as they could. But it was never as attractive and as comfortable as those who went on to the Molushna. That's why when the people came from the Molushna, perhaps a little earlier than these Lone Tree people, they came with financial means. They were able to sell their goods for reasonable prices. They were able to come and buy supplies for the farm, build houses, and the local economy loved them. But that wasn't so with our ancestors from Lone Tree. This is an important point. The Old Flemish connection. Following the time of Menno Simons in Holland, there were already variations beginning to develop within the Mennonite faith. And we're well acquainted that there have always been variations of belief in the Mennonite faith. But that already happened in Holland. There was the Old Flemish, there were the Frisians, there were the Waterlanders, there's one called the Lamb group. The Old Flemish were connected closely with those of our ancestors in Chekhovka. They joined the Groningen Old Flemish Society. They had contact with them. There were visitors that went back and forth. And because of their religious practices, you know, there has always been some difference between the Lone Tree people who joined Holdeman and other Mennonites in this area. And that didn't happen here. It continued here. Because of their religious practices, there was already some separation from other Mennonite groups in Poland and Russia, and later in America. And that is because of the Old Flemish connections that they had and the Old Flemish beliefs, of which we'll enumerate just a few. And that is also very likely why the efforts of the local General Conference Mennonites from Mound Ridge, Christian Crable, others, the Mennonite Brethren and the Kermer Mennonite Brethren from Hillsboro, who came to offer spiritual oversight and pastoring to the Lone Tree people, were sometimes rebuffed and were not always welcome. It was because of the differences they brought with them from Russia. The Old Flemish, a few of the things that they held to, that these folks were familiar with. It had become rather formalistic. I think much of Mennonitism at that time had become rather formalistic. There was good principle, but that they carried the same living treasure in their hearts may not be quite so clear. But this is what they believed in part: an unsalaried ministry, feet washing with communion, which was only observed when the congregation was at peace, plain living and clothing, excommunication and the band, baptism or rebaptism for all applicants for membership. And you can see that those practices would have been at some variance with some of the other Mennonite practices of their neighbors. And that caused some separation both in Russia and later in Kansas. Okay, living as they were in Russia, Catherine had promised them military exemption for all time. But Catherine died, and some of those dreams and promises died with her. I think it was her grandson, Tsar Alexander II, decided that they had had those special privileges long enough, that it was time for them to become Russians. And so he took away those privileges in about 1870, and they were required to become Russian citizens. They were required to abandon their German language and speak Russian. They would no longer be exempt from military service. They would lose control of their schools, and they were given 10 years either to comply or to emigrate. I don't think he expected them to emigrate in the numbers that they did. He didn't realize the grit those people had, nor the conviction they carried in their hearts, and how important those privileges were to them. And when he saw that they meant business, then he began to back up on some of those demands. And yes, the boys could serve in forester units. They didn't have to go to war, but it would still be under government auspices, and really for the Mennonites that came, it was too little, too late. And I think those privileges perhaps continued until about World War I, but then things fell apart badly for the Mennonites who stayed. So, although many Mennonites stayed in Russia, virtually all of the Volhynians, which was the area in Russia where they settled, the village of Antonovka, Lilova, and others in that community, they were in the Volhynian region, and so the Antonovkans decided to go to America. That was a dream. They didn't have a clue what they were up to. I will insert here that the temperature in here is part of the story. Okay. We need to introduce Tobias A. Unruh. There were two Tobias A. Unruhs, and we shouldn't confuse them. This one was the district minister of the Ostroger group there in Russia, a bishop, if you will, and he was responsible for several villages and congregations, is my understanding. I've seen his personal record of baptisms, and he was a busy bishop. He was also one of the delegation who visited America to investigate the feasibility and possibilities of locating here. Interestingly, after the decision was made to come, and he was going to accompany some of his people, the Karlsbaldi people, who were also near the Antonovkans, all part of the same area. I think it was near Antwerp. One of his children, I understand, came down with smallpox, and so had to remain aboard a special ship with sick people, and he had to stay there with the child, and his people headed out across the Atlantic without their leader, which was disconcerting to both of them, I'm sure. Later, when he came, he settled with the Karlsbaldi group in South Dakota, and you can see he died in 1875, so he barely got here, joined his people, and then he passed away. But he was a very influential man in the Lone Tree story, because his investigation, his reporting, his leadership, his influence definitely caused them or encouraged them to come. He was one of the group of 12 who journeyed to America in 1873 to investigate the feasibility of immigration. They visited numerous of the prairie states and the province of Manitoba, to which many of the Kleine-Gemeinde people went and settled the east and west reserves over there, but that's not part of today's story. This is interesting to me. Unruh never visited Kansas. He had church one day 5 miles from Kansas, but that was in Nebraska. He never visited Kansas, but he went home and told his people how great the place was. Upon his return to Russia, he may have oversold the area, describing the homes and farms of Mennonites already well established, rather than the harsh realities of taming the prairie with its extremes of cold, heat, drought, storm, and wind. However, his positive report encouraged his people to come. I understand that Kansas was so balmy they did not even pack heavy winter clothes.
Oh boy.
He had painted a pretty rosy picture, and they didn't have room for heavy winter clothes, but that's one thing they left home because they weren't going to need them here. It was far too pleasant for that. Interestingly, again with the importance of military exemption, they wanted to find out, will the United States give us the privilege not to go to war, or will they not? And I find it interesting that they just went to the top. Some of the group of 12 who were here visiting went to New York City. I think Ulysses S. Grant was spending some summertime there on Long Island, maybe to escape the heat of Washington. And they found out where he was, and they asked for an audience with him. And this is part of Tobias Unruh's report of that meeting. On August 8, we left New York at 8 a.m. to see the president. At 8 p.m., we were introduced to the president at his residence. He is president of all the states of the Union of the United States. And this is less than 10 years after he took General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. It was an interesting time. Our agent Hiller sent his servants to him with a message, and also our petition and plea. Can we have military exemption in the United States or can we not? He looked them through, then requested that we come and meet him. He was a plain man and very friendly. They probably were looking for someone aristocratic like the Tsar or nobility that they had been more acquainted with in Europe, and here they found a frumpy man in a brown suit that looked just like they did. I think that impressed them. He informed us that the Constitution has a concession that it will not override a man's conscience, and religious freedom is guaranteed. I think he also told them they had just come through one major war and he didn't anticipate another one for 50 years and they were good to go.
Okay.
All right. So he went home, he reported about that, he reported, Tobias did, about how attractive America was. And in 1874, most of the Antonovkans prepared to journey to America, selling their homes and belongings for what they could get for them. That's important because what if in this community 90 farms suddenly became available for sale?
Mm-hmm.
You would have a buyer's market, right? Plus, what if they knew that on a certain date everyone is going to be on a ship heading for another continent? They could offer what they would because they were going to turn the property, right? So they sold their homes and belongings for what they could get for them. It is likely they sold out to Baptists and Lutherans who were moving into the area, and local Bohemians may also have taken their possessions for practically nothing. So whatever they had been able to accumulate, whatever their assets, the fare for the ocean voyage and rail travel to Kansas was around $35 to $45 per adult. Children traveled for half of that. Many did not have enough for the passage. After they had sold out, had nothing, they didn't have, so if they had 6 children, 70, 150, they didn't have enough money to pay for the fare, and so they borrowed from each other or from the Mennonites who were already here. Each family was allowed a shipping box or trunk measuring 8 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, 2 feet high. Interestingly, some of the dowry trunks that we see in museums and maybe some of you have in your homes also qualified as shipping material containers, and they came across here as well. Only the most important items could be taken to America. What would you put in yours? Out of your house full of stuff, what would you put into a box that big, because this is what we need? Interestingly, my great-great-granddad, I don't know if he didn't think they had wheels in America, but they took apart a farm wagon and packed it in and brought it to Kansas and used it at Inman for a number of years. I don't know if it all fit in that trunk or not. Okay. One required item was a burial shroud, highlighting the perils of the journey. That'd be a rather solemn thing to put in, but that was real and that was life. Their families and their few belongings were loaded onto wagons. Final goodbyes were said to those staying in Russia. My grandpa said they had all-night farewells. It was like a funeral. He said we knew we would never see them again. They knew they would never see each other again. They left all they had known behind. At the rail station, they boarded the train, traveled overland to Antwerp, Belgium, to meet the Vaterland for the voyage across the Atlantic. There is a tradition or a legend that says that when they met at the train station for the last time, there were those who were going, there were those who were staying, and they were saying goodbye and saying goodbye until eternity. And it is said that this song was sung whenever they had one of those parting meetings. the speaker went to sleep before the program. I'll play the verse once more. It is well sung. It didn't sound like that on the platform. They sang through their tears. The Vaterland, I don't think, was a luxury liner or a cruise ship in any way. The sails were to supplement the power from the boilers and the propeller. I have heard that the voyage was too stormy and they wouldn't put the sails up anyway. So, they departed Antwerp, Belgium, December 4, 1874, 20 first-class cabins, the rest of the passengers in steerage. And steerage is a very polite way of saying very poor accommodations. Down below decks, maybe a berth. I don't know if any privacy. I don't think so. They were just steerage, baggage. But yeah, that comes next. Okay. This is interesting to me. They were depending on that one propeller to get them here. It was a rough voyage. They lost one blade in the English Channel. That's pretty close to home. About mid-ocean, they lost the second blade. And I don't know how they wobbled that ship the rest of the way across the ocean with only one blade on that prop. And then near the port of Philadelphia, they lost the last one. I guess they just drifted in. I don't know. But the important thing is they made it. 5 of the group died en route. They used the burial shrouds. It was an infant or two, maybe a few older people. And the ritual was pretty simple. They wrapped the body in the shroud. They put them on a board. They gathered on the deck and had a service, sang a hymn or so. They tilted the board. The body slid off into the ocean, and they went on their way. 5 times that happened as they came. It was a horrible journey. It took, as you can see, they arrived in Philadelphia Christmas Day, 1874, 3 weeks on that ship. And can you imagine 3 weeks without a decent change of clothes, without a chance to take a bath, being violently seasick some of the time, having a funeral 5 times on the way, no privacy? I can't imagine that journey, but they made it. And interestingly, they didn't do it for them, they did it for us. 662 of the 708 passengers were Mennonites from Russia. And look at this. In the Holdeman Church, the Canes or the Cohens are pretty dominant. And you can see why. Look at that. 184 Canes, 96 Janses, 85 Schmidts, 73 Unruhs, 49 Weedles, 47 Beckers, 45 Bullers, 27 Nachtigalls or Nightingales, 22 Ratzliffs, 15 Ecks, 13 Voths, 3 Peters, and 3 Seabrands. And my roots go into the Ratzliffs and the Beckers and the Nightingales, I think, and maybe the Unruhs. But then I've got about half of it that comes from the Malashna, so I think I'm an immigrant through and through. Okay, tragedy. Although some thought the immigrants should winter in Pennsylvania, they landed there Christmas Day. They unwisely chose to press on to Kansas. Tickets had been purchased to Atchison. They were already en route. To wait until spring to travel would incur added expense. And so their leaders Remember, Tobias Under is not with them. There are other men who are leading. And they said, no, we're going on. We're going to Kansas. Still expecting favorable conditions and weather there, I think. They should have stayed in Pennsylvania. There were Mennonites there who were well established. They had warm homes. They had plenty of food. Granted, there were 700 of them. But it would have been better than what happened. They continued by rail on to Hutchinson. They arrived on the night of December 31, 1874. The temperature was 12 degrees below zero. And they dumped out on the platform at the station, and there was nobody there to meet them.
Wow.
Bernard Workington, I think, knew they were coming. He didn't know what in the world he should do. He pled with the others who were helping him with this immigration project, and there he was in Kansas to welcome them, but what can one man do for 700 people? So there they were. All right. Furthermore, Hutchinson had said, we want these people, because the Melush people had come a year before with money, remember? And they said, the Bueller people, the Inman people, they said, look, we need more of those people. Send these folks over. When they got there, they were penniless. They were paupers. They didn't have anything. They had borrowed money to get there. And so I understand that the businessmen of Hutchinson stood around the mayor's desk and said, sorry, we can't help these folks. All right. Kind-hearted people opened buildings and empty houses for them, and they stayed there in Hutchinson for several days, I think. Bernard Workington ordered ovens and provided flour and some meat. They ate. They were warmed up. I hope they got to change clothes and take a bath, but that was very temporary. Then the railroad loaded them up into boxcars like cattle at night, took them back to Florence because there was some empty buildings there, and that's where they were going to have temporary winter quarters. This is from Christian Crable in his autobiography. He was closely associated with that, and he had first-hand knowledge. He visited there. The situation was 10 times worse than I had imagined. Even the few windows in the gables closed. They were in about a 30 by 80 warehouse, and maybe in a few other buildings, but we're talking 700 people, and they were crammed in there as tight as they could in whatever shelter they could find. And the Ukrainians, and I understand they still have this, and do any of you? I think my mom used to tell me the night air wasn't good for me. So he says even the few windows in the gables were closed. Someone would open the door of the window, they'd say, close that. We're going to get sick if you leave that open. They got sick because they didn't leave it open, in part. Okay, the whole floor packed, he's describing the building here. Even the few windows in the gables closed, the whole floor packed full of bedding, stacks of straw, cooking and eating utensils, laid full up until there was only a small path in the middle, and this small aisle standing full of people, and children sick, lying at the sides without fresh air. Just think of a heap of people in this kind of closed room, many sick with high fever, coal-burning fumes drenching the air which is breathed over and over again by the people. Add to this the poor food, little water and soap for personal cleanliness, not to mention cleansing the room, and when you have imagined this, then your fantasy has still pictured rather poorly the real dilemma. That's how they made the winter. Okay, in the crowded, unsanitary conditions in a 30 by 80 foot warehouse at Florence, evidently a smallpox epidemic broke out in the winter of 1874 and 75, causing much death. In the spring, heavy rains contaminated the water supply from the manure lots and so on, and cholera claimed even more lives. Although it is reported that about 300 died, that is unlikely. However, many, including their 2 minister leaders, died that winter, were buried at Florence, some in mass unmarked graves. I was over at Tabor College one day visiting with Peggy Gertzen, and she said, where are you going next on your little tour? And I said, we're going to Florence. And she said, well, you know that's not documented, right? And I said, yes, I realize that. It's legendary to some degree. The records for the cemetery were destroyed in a fire over there at Florence. But if you go to the Hillcrest Cemetery in Florence, in the northwest corner you will see that little sign that says the Potter's Field. It's an unmarked area, and there is good evidence that there are indeed mass graves in that cemetery. and many died. I question if it's 300 because that would have been almost half the group, but it was many. And interestingly, I sent this to Peggy Gertson later because in collecting historical items for the library in Mound Ridge, I got this, the autobiography of Tobias T. Cohen, or Kane, and he was a boy in that building. And he didn't say a lot about it, but this is what he wrote of his boyhood memory. In that confined building, many of the Mennonites got sick and many died. Almost every day there was a funeral, and sometimes 2 people died in one day. We were told the cause of death was for lack of food. I don't believe that, because Bernard Workington, the Crabels in Mound Ridge, the local people were taking better care of them than that. They were making sure they had flour, they were making sure they had some meat, they were making sure they weren't starving. I don't think they died from lack of food. When food was no longer a problem, then it was illness that resulted from malnutrition. My note is that many deaths were likely due to the smallpox epidemic and the cholera. But I think it's established that, and this is heartbreaking, when I think of the cost of leaving, when I think of the rigors of coming, when I think of the horrors of that winter, and on the doorstep of possibility, they died. Mm-hmm. And never realized their dream, but some didn't die. That's why the Lone Tree people, that's why I'm here. Because some survived the winter. But it was a horrible winter. They would go there to preach to those people. They would go there to visit those people. They couldn't hardly stand to step into the room. It was putrid, just like he described in his report there. But that's the conditions that they spent the winter in. All right, spring finally came. In the spring of 1875, following the tragic winter, the remnants of the group at Florence regrouped. Some new family units were formed. I'm pretty sure that is factual, because it couldn't have been otherwise. What in the world happened? A husband died over here, a wife and mother died over here, both parents died over here, children died over here. How did they regroup in the spring? There wasn't Social Security, there wasn't can care, there wasn't any other resource except themselves and the Mennonites who were here helping them and God. And there had to almost be some marriages of convenience, like I have 4 children and no wife. You have 3 children and no husband. Some of that had to happen, didn't it? I don't know how they did that. Nieces moved in with nephews, with uncles and aunts. Widows moved in with other families. And somehow they regrouped, and somehow they formed family units. And they were transported with their belongings to land acquired from the Santa Fe Railroad in the Lone Tree Township. They were likely taken by train to Halstead. The train that goes through McPherson wasn't there yet until some years later, maybe a decade. They were likely taken by train to Halstead, then by wagon north to their new home. They were provided lumber for 28 houses, 90 families. How are you going to get 90 families in 28 houses? There were some sod structures built, I'm sure, and some temporary housing, but they were provided lumber for 28 houses. Plows, oxen, and milk cows were shared by the group. Each family was assigned to 40 acres of land. Land with creek access sold for $3.50 an acre, land without for $2 an acre. The creeks in those days, I think, were clear. They drained prairie land, not farmland. Creek access was very important to them for drinking water, for cleaning, and for life. So, if your land had a creek running through it, $3.50 an acre. If it didn't, $2 an acre. Generous terms were offered by the railroad. No payment due for 5 years, full payment to be made after 10 years. So here's the Lone Tree Township, and you can see in this illustration the checkerboard, because the railroad was putting a track through the area. The government rewarded them by giving them every other section of land. So they could negotiate with the Mennonites on those every other sections of land that they owned and negotiate very favorable terms for them. Now, there's a couple interesting things to note here. If you can see, you see on this one how this creek runs through here? See how they laid out their 40 acres in strips so that everybody got some water? That's also more how they laid out their villages in Russia. They would have the village street and the house and the orchard and the garden and the land behind, and then the herdsman would come every morning and take the stock to a common pasture, deliver them to the gate in the afternoon. You can see the same thing in this section, only they're laid out the other way because the creek runs this way. And this is where the lone tree was, right here. And you can see that it's in a bend of the Turkey Creek. That's what saved that tree for many, many years. Other trees were taken by the forest fires. Most of the forest fires would sweep up from the south, and the Turkey Creek provided a natural fire break, and that tree survived. And that's why it was the lone tree of the township, a landmark for those on the Santa Fe Trail, a landmark for the Indians, and that's why we talk about Lone Tree today.
May I borrow your stick?
You may, ma'am.
Right here's where I live.
Nice.
Very good.
That's where I am.
All right. Now, here's the cottonwood. Yeah. Okay, the present Lone Tree Church sits right here. And you see this, we've looked at that section before. There's still one of those half-mile roads that runs right up through there called Raccoon Trail. And if you ever drive up through there, you can see how the homes are located close together. That's still a remnant of the old laying out of the property in 1874 when they located the Mennonites there. All right. They came in 1875 in the spring. They spent the summer. They broke some sod. They planted some potatoes. They planted a little wheat maybe. They planted vegetables. They built those 28 houses. And this is a report that John F. Funk wrote when he visited in October. And this tells you a little bit the ongoing difficulty of getting a toehold on the prairie. He wrote this letter after he visited them about 6 or 8 months after they arrived. It was a cold, cloudy, dreary day, and it was very windy. I can tell you it was a hard sight to see them, even the women and children walking about in their low slippers without stockings, and the children with hands and faces purple on account of the cold blasts. Many of the children were lying or sitting on their beds or pallets, made of straw sack laid on the floorless earth in the huts, and covered themselves with feather beds to keep comfortable, as there was neither stove nor fire. We stopped at one house in which there lived 6 families. That's how they handled the 28 houses for 90 families. 6 families in one house. One family sat in a corner just eating their breakfast, which consisted of a dish of potato soup cooked with dry prairie grass, corn stalks, weeds, and roots gathered on the prairie. This was not forested land. Now look at this. The house itself was 16 by 20 feet, as near as we could judge. Think living room, okay? 6 families living in there. I don't understand that. The roof was of the same material, and the boards on the side, not having been seasoned, dried and shrank considerably after having been nailed on, so there were large openings between through which the wind blew, strong and fierce. And that's how they made the next winter. I can't imagine. James Yoder used to live in Heston. He wrote the novel The Lone Tree, and this is kind of a poignant little quote in his novel. Luzana was the heroine of the story, and she said, "Someday in the future, there will be a church near here. Surely it will be called the Lone Tree Church." She wanted to say more, but held her words to herself. She wanted to say, "And the church, like the leaves of this tree, will be for the healing of hearts and nations." Now, we must introduce David S. Holdeman. David Holdeman was an uncle to John Holdeman, who began the Church of God in Christ Mennonite, or known as the Holdeman Church. This was his uncle, and he was already a member of that church. And his son, John, who is a cousin to John Holdeman, who began the Church of God in Christ Mennonite, for some reason completely unknown to me, moved to Kansas in 1872. And he settled 2 miles north and 2 miles east of Heston, even though Heston's in parentheses there because Heston did not exist. Heston was not founded until well into the 1880s. And so why he settled there, I cannot tell you. I know that he worked on the railroad, but for some reason his dad, David S. Holdeman, came to visit him in 1873, and he liked the prairies well enough that he purchased a pretty nice tract of land where the Heston or Meridian Church is today, 2 miles east, 2 miles north of Heston. His home was just a quarter of a mile north where Larry Brozick used to live. And that's where he homesteaded. Part of the old original barn wall is still there. The stone wall that he laid into the hill. Okay. And for some reason, he moved to Kansas. I don't know why. And he was a member of the Church of God in Christ Mennonite, and he was appointed to serve on the Kansas Local Relief Committee. There was a Mennonite Board of Guardians with Bernard Workington, whom I've mentioned, and a few others from around the country, but this was a local committee who were to help these people get settled, give them financial assistance, and help them begin to find their way on the prairie. Peter Buller, Bernard Workington helped them, Christian Hirschler, and Christian Schmutz. David Holdeman was the treasurer. He collected a lot of funds from Mennonites throughout the United States. I understand he donated a lot of personal funds to help those people, but he is very instrumental in the Lone Tree story because he was the uncle of John Holdeman, Wayne County, Ohio. That's where John's little church was in those years. And after visiting with those people in the Lone Tree area, the Antonophkans, those who were already somewhat separate from the other Mennonite groups in the old countries, it was said that he saw that they were spiritually, morally, and economically bankrupt. And they needed help. And he knew that his nephew John was a minister, that he had passion for the gospel, and that maybe he should come and preach to those people. And so he invited him to come. John Holdeman was born in 1832 in Ohio. He began the Church of God in Christ Mennonite in 1859. Then, at the invitation of his uncle David, he came to Kansas in 1878. That wasn't the first time he'd been in Kansas. I think he'd been at Alexanderville as early as some years before that. But anyway, he came to Kansas in 1878, and he began to preach among those Lone Tree people. Remember, with the old Groningen Flemish history, and his doctrine matched that. And so they warmed to his preaching. And he preached there in 1878. His first sermon was in the Emmanuel Mennonite Church just west of 27th Avenue. And soon he began preaching in the homes of some of those who were showing interest in his message. Then he later moved to Lone Tree in 1897. He died in 1900. This is from the history of the Lone Tree congregation as they have written it. Various Mennonite groups offered them worship opportunities, which some accepted, but others did not. I've gone through a little of that earlier. In the fall of 1878, John Holdeman visited this community and preached his first sermon in the Emmanuel Church located on Section 27. He soon met with those who worshiped in their homes. When they heard him preach his first sermon, they believed he preached the truth, for his preaching was light and life to them. It was a belief, a doctrine, values that they had brought with them for hundreds of years. 70 souls were converted and received baptism upon the confession of their faith, and the Lone Tree congregation was formed there in 1878. Now, this is another interesting saga. This is the other Tobias A. Unruh. He had settled over in Pawnee Rock, but then he had moved to this area, and he had gone to the Emmanuel Church and had become one of their ministers. But he was not at rest there, he was not content there, and this is his own testimony from his autobiography. The time came when he decided, I have to make a decision. I have to decide if I'm staying at Emmanuel or if I'm going to go with the Lone Tree people. And he was preaching over there at Emmanuel. He knew that that would come at tremendous cost to him personally, to his family, to his parishioners, but he was struggling with what he was feeling in his own heart. And he left for church one morning. As I was on my way to church and meditating which road I should take, he didn't know which way he was going to turn. It appeared as though someone guided me to the church to which I believe God led me, and I want to dwell therein all the days of my life. Just before I stepped upon the porch, Benjamin Schmidt announced the hymn, "With a treasure like that, Abraham departed." I said to myself, that is true. I have also departed with a treasure. Then in the sermon it was preached about the pearl of great price. That was the only reason that I left all my relatives and departed from them. That had to be a very painful time for the Emmanuel Church, for their minister to walk out the back door and to go and join Holdeman's church. In a few years he was chosen a minister in the Holdeman Church. He served as an able bishop there until into the 1940s. And I can't imagine the feelings and the heart tearing of, he said, that's why I left my relatives and departed from them. Even his wife, she followed him later, but it must have been a difficult chapter, but that was his decision. So in 1879, they built the first Lone Tree Church. It was a sod structure, 20 by 40 feet, located 7 miles north of Mound Ridge, a mile north of the north corner where you turn to go to Lone Tree now. The floor was 4 feet below ground level, covered with sand from a nearby creek. A few rows of backless benches were placed lengthwise for the worshipers, and then they laid up the sod walls and the sod roof. They only used that for about 1 year, 1879 to 1880. It was obviously a temporary structure. And I can imagine this song being sung there, but probably not the way this sounds. I thought that speaker had a longer sleep time than that.
Ich weiß, ein Strom dessen herrliche Flut fließt wunderbar stille durchs Land, doch strahlt und glänzt wie feurige Glut. Wem ist dieses Wasser bekannt? O selig, ich bitte dich, komm und zu diesen herrlichen Strom. Sein Wasser fließt frei und mächtig Licht. O glaubst, es fließe für dich.
I noticed someone was singing German with them. A little different from today's structure. You can't even see the sanctuary wing to the back of that, but a lot has changed in 150 years. There were 3 church buildings in between there. Interestingly, the one that was built in about 1890 eventually had a wing put on it, which was a school. It's the first school of the Church of God in Christ Mennonite. There were several men from the Lone Tree congregation who taught it, and it was not only for the Holdeman kids, it was for the community. And I would like to know more about that school and how long it operated. Okay, the Lone Tree congregation has been very important in our denomination. It has always been the largest, ever since day one. There were more people baptized at that time in Manitoba, but they formed 4 congregations instead of 1. Current membership is 303. At its peak in 1967, there were 688 members, Sunday school enrollment of 824. If it was still only 1 congregation, it would be bigger than that. But the Gospel Mennonite Church in Mound Ridge, formed in 1971, the United Center, over there north and west of Canton in 1973, and Suncrest just south of Galva in 2006. So, and the express purpose of that was to lower the membership from 688 to something that shepherds could handle better. That's really too many for a flock. So now there are 4 congregations instead of 1, and literally thousands have moved and relocated to other congregations throughout the Holdeman Church, and especially in the United States. But it has been a very important congregation. That large church that you saw, the conference helped build the first one there in 1959. It's been added on to since, but it was to be a central place for large conference meetings and things like that. And the Lone Tree congregation has contributed immensely to the programs of the Church of God in Christ Mennonite. We respect them deeply for that. All right. If you haven't read this book, you need to. The Lone Tree by James Yoder. It's a novel. I quoted a little sentence from it earlier. Frankly, it's not greatly written. But the content is good. Of course, it has a novel's plot. You know, Luzanna married Carl at the end of the book. But
Spoiler.
but the pain of leaving, the horrors of the trip, what happened in Florence, how to relocate on the prairie and start to get a toehold there and make a life. He does an excellent job of capturing all of that. It's not a very big book. It will give you a very, very, I think, realistic picture of the cost of the Lone Tree people in settling there in the Lone Tree Township. Additional resources, if you are interested. Living in the World by Ronald Jantz. That's an excellent history of Anabaptism and Mennonite history, including the Church of God in Christ Mennonite. The Lone Tree, which I just advertised for you. And The Helpless Poles by Abe J. Unruh. I see Tony here. His grandpa wrote that book, and he was a very, very knowledgeable man about these things. A lot of James Yoder's information would have come from that book, and probably Ronald's as well. All of those books are available from Gospel Publishers in Mound Ridge, gospelpublishers.com/USA if you want to order them online. And I understand this is going to be preserved for the Schweitzer and Friends website, so you can reference all of that later if you choose. But those are excellent resources. If you want more of the Lone Tree story, we've looked at it in a very brief way today, and you can see more of it there. There's one more song, and this one's special to me because I have mentioned the importance of the sacrifice so that we can be here. We can live in America. We can live our faith. We can be free. We trust it will always be that way. It's because of the sacrifice of these folks, and your grandpas and grandmas too. But this song is sung by grandchildren of the immigration. Actually, this is my daughter and her family, but they are like great grandchildren, but still, they're here because they came, right? So,
Jesus, still lean on till our rest be won, and although the way be cheerless, we will follow calm and fearless. Guide us by thy hand to our
David is 18 and Alan is 15. Lily is 12. And Craig and Donna sing with them a lot. And I appreciate that very much. She told me on Father's Day, she said, I'm going to instill in my children the same love of song that you instilled in me. She's far, far surpassed that. I'm proud of that. Okay, thank you very much for your kind attention. It's a good story, a sad story, a happy story, but a meaningful one. So thanks for sharing it with us today.